I'm joined by the former Community Secretary Hazel Blears, who helped run the Prevent strategy under Labour, and Douglas Murray, Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society. It's a foreign affairs think tank. Welcome to you both. Hazel Blears, we've heard the politicians say what they say after a terrible atrocity like this happens, and we step up security. And what is said is well said and well meant too. But does anything in the end ever change?
Well, it's inevitable, isn't it, that after an event like this, people will concentrate on the here and now, and that is this operation to bring people to justice, and that's to be expected. I actually want us to take a bit of a step back and to think about what is it that's going on in our country and around the world, where we've got a kind of supply chain of people coming through who are radicalised, and not just radicalised, but prepared to kill and kill themselves in the process. Now, at 7/7, that was the first time we'd ever experienced that in this country. There was a kind of sense of national shock that 3 young men brought up and educated in the British education system could actually set out on a murderous bombing mission. And it's happened again. And it's happened in
10 years later?
10 years later, a decade on. And it's happened in France and Belgium and Spain and around the world. And my concern is that we've done some good work in Prevent and bringing communities together, and the Channel programme with the de-radicalisation, but actually we haven't really tackled this ideology. And I went to see the David Cameron's task force that he set up together with a Conservative colleague on a cross-party basis, and we gave them a paper, and it was really about saying, can we take apart this ideology of hating the West, of having a caliphate and a theocracy around the world, and being prepared to murder on the basis that if you die you go to paradise. It's a threadbare, worthless ideology. And we tackle Nazism, we tackle fascism, and we need the same determination, I think, to be able to tackle this ideology. Then we might be getting somewhere. But at the moment, I just don't think that we are marshalling our resources in the way that we ought to be. It is an existential threat.
Though in the end, we only
need to meet it.
defeated Nazism because of total war.
Indeed, and I wouldn't be advocating that at all.
It wasn't really the idea in the end. It was the total war that won. What lessons are we failing to learn?
Well, every imaginable one. We don't want to listen to what the extremists say. We don't want to believe that they mean what they say. We still seem to be, even after all of these years, in this strange cycle. Hazel quite rightly says we're not preparing to fight this ideology, but I mean, our politicians, I think, from all parties, are very reluctant to even name the ideology in question. There's a concerted effort after an attack like that on Monday night not to listen to what the sort of things that are said that would impel somebody to do something like that, to listen to what they say, what they mean. Last month, the national act of mourning in Westminster Abbey after the Westminster terrorist attacks, just down the road from here. The Dean of Westminster, on behalf of this nation, stood up in the pulpit of Westminster Abbey and said, we may never know what would drive somebody to do this. Sorry, we do know. We know why somebody like Khaled Massoud did what he did on Westminster Bridge and outside the House of Parliament. We know why somebody like this young man did what he did on Monday night in Manchester. They keep telling us. It's just we don't want to listen.
So what is it? Is the Islamist ideology?
Yes, and many...
Don't we know that? Don't we recognise that?
No. And but particularly, we don't want to recognise where it comes from.
Where does it come from?
It comes from the religion. It is the worst possible interpretation of the religion, but it comes from it. And we are very reluctant in our society to face up to that, because underneath all of this, there's something else happening. The politicians are talking about the technical issues to do with terrorism and security. But the publics of Europe, including the public in Britain, are thinking totally different things. They're thinking at the moment, for instance, how can it be that we may bring a couple of Libyans who may have suffered under Colonel Gaddafi into our country as asylum seekers, and maybe they're pro-Britain, maybe they're the most pro-British people ever, but maybe their child will turn up to a pop concert one night and blow a bunch of women...
But how would you ever know that?
We don't. This is the issue.
I'm not sure what the policy follows, that we shouldn't have let them in the first place.
The policy issue is, as I say, that the public are wondering whether this whole idea of mass migration, of the borderless world and all these sort of things is such a good idea. And I think the publics are coming to a different conclusion to the politicians. It's right we have the security questions, but we should also, as a country, be thinking about the deeper underlying things. And finally, if I may say so, when Hazel says we have to tackle this underlying ideology and fight united and so on. I agree. But we've got to appropriately designate the problem. And Hazel, you know, we still have...
All right, you need to let Hazel Blears speak.
No, I think we probably share some of the analysis, Douglas, but I'm a practical person. And what I've set out to do with the PREVENT programme was not simply to describe the problem. And I agree with you, it needs to be named. But the overwhelming majority of Muslim people would totally reject this ideology. And therefore, what we need to do is have a series of practical programmes. It's core to have education, and not just of the Muslim community, but of other faiths as well, to understand this, to have critical thinking so that you can challenge the ideas of the extremists, because they're very simple. They're actually very stupid as well.
Yes.
And if you're able to have the ammunition, if you like, bad word, but, you know, the arguments to use. But, Douglas, you know, it's all very well to have rhetoric. Rhetoric can really inflame the situation. You need a careful, measured view with a proper programme and properly resourced
Hazel,
as well.
Can I just say, the PREVENT programme is a prime example of this. I've had all sorts of criticism of PREVENT, as have you. But what is one of the unanimous issues with PREVENT? There is almost total pushback against the policy from day one, from the self-appointed leadership of the Muslim community. That is one of the overwhelming things with PREVENT. People say, I've got a problem with this bit, a problem with that bit. No. Most people that you hear from within the Muslim communities, there are terrific examples of people who stand out from this, are against having any policy. It's not they dislike a bit of the policy, they don't want the policy.
I disagree.
And your
I
neighbour,
disagree with you again.
All right, let Hazel Blears speak.
I disagree with you again, because what you're saying is that the people who are anti-PREVENT, if you like, are the majority voice. They might be the loudest, but they're not the majority of voice. There are a lot of good, decent people in the community, young people who've become...
But within the leadership,
they have
Hazel.
become absolute stars, and when they get the opportunity of a leadership platform, they are amazing young people.
Okay.
Women in the same place. You can't just paint everybody with the
No,
same brush.
and I
It's a
didn't
very
do that.
dangerous
Let me
path to
bring
tread.
Chris, and you've been listening to this. It's quite hard to see what the policy response is to this. I mean, your job, you have to pick up the pieces, in a sense, of the failure of a political strategy, because it has led to terrorism. But I'm not quite sure what should we be doing to stop it becoming your problem?
Well, I think,
Education.
I mean, what we've seen actually across Europe, and if you think back to the attackers from Paris, certainly one of them was able to go back to his location in Molenbeek, 100 metres from where he was born and brought up, and hide from the police. There is such a disconnect between the community and the police force, certainly in that country. Now, what we've seen today, perhaps, is something going on, not quite the same, but along those lines within Manchester. And I think, for all of our sakes, we need to break down communities that see themselves as insular and not linked into the rest of the state.
I mean, you said education, but I bet he was educated. He went to Salford University. He was studying business management.
When I said education,
he wasn't some illiterate whose mind had been warped.
His mind clearly was warped.
But not because he wasn't educated.
No, but when I say education, I mean education literally from primary school, to be able to understand that this kind of extremism is not something that represents your faith. It's not something that you want to be involved with. So you can be educated, to a top level, but you can still be driven by this ideology.
But at their time, politicians have this great faith in education. At their time, the Germans were the best educated people in the world, and they ended up with Hitler.
Indeed, and that shows you the strength of an ideology, doesn't it?
It shows the strength of the ideology
Absolutely.
and the importance of countering it, but you can't counter it if you simply think that it is solvable by Hazel Blears or Amber Rudd or anyone else coming up with a counter ideology. These people believe they're acting in the name of their God, and they may not listen to a British minister or a former British minister. And we've got to have a line to them that breaks right through to the heart of their warped ideology.
But what does that mean? And that's a metaphor. What does that? No, I want to find out what Douglas. I want to know what the policy response is, not the metaphor.
The first, if I may say so, the first thing is that politicians and others have to acknowledge that when these things happen, instead of we're learning from them, coming together and so on, we say we didn't want this sort of thing to happen. We never wanted to get to this place where we had people, including first and second generation immigrants in this country, blowing people up at pop concerts. And there is no single way to deal with that. But I can tell you one of the worst ways to deal with is when people, like, unfortunately, unfortunately, Andy Burnham, now the Mayor of Manchester, in campaign not only to scrap the prevent strategy, but not even suggesting something to go in its place. The current strategy is about the best strategy going. It has all sorts of flaws, but I'd much rather have it than people who believe we should have no strategy at all.
On that we are agreed, Douglas.
We are.
Then we shall come to an end. We've run out of time.